Good morning. It is wonderful to see everyone this morning. We've been talking for a few weeks on Sunday nights about different people listed in Hebrews chapter 11, about why they are in that list. Some of them don't seem like they should be in that list. Some of them are just interesting to dig more into as we think about that list. I want to look at one of those this morning for our worship hour this morning because she is one of the most fascinating characters, I think, in the Old Testament. We're going to talk about Rahab. Rahab, of course, a resident of Jericho when the conquest of Canaan begins. But we want to look this morning at her story, as we've been looking at the other stories, to try and get a sense, not so much maybe of why she's there, because certainly her story is one of faith. That's pretty evident, unlike some of the others who are listed in Hebrews 11. But to get a sense of what it means for her to be there in light of some different issues that we will discuss. As Israel left the land of Egypt, remember, in their world, the land of Egypt would be a superpower, not unlike the U.S. or China or something like that in our global world today. For them, they left this superpower of their day, and many things happened in the process. God demonstrated great power through the plagues, through the crossing of the Red Sea, through his preservation of Israel as they journeyed through the wilderness. Now, in their day and their time, the gods, meaning all the idols that were worshipped by most civilizations, they claimed that these idols had powers similar to what God displayed. And of course, there were legends of things like this happening. But also, of course, those are idols. Those are dead hunks of metal and stone and wood. None of those things had actually occurred as a result of those idols. So whenever these things occurred, naturally they caused a stir. Not just in Egypt. News traveled far and wide of what God had been doing for the Israelites. And people began thinking, yes, we know that our gods, supposedly in their minds, can do amazing things, but this God seems to be doing things far and away beyond anything we've ever heard of in our time, at least. The reputation travels, not just throughout Egypt, certainly, not just throughout the areas immediately surrounding Egypt, but all the way to Canaan. We've got to remember there is a major trade route at this time from Egypt to Canaan, so the word would have traveled without too much delay, at least by comparison. And as you might imagine, since the people of Canaan in particular know that they are Israel's destination, this is not something that Israel has kept secret. They have said, Canaan is ours, we are coming to claim it. The Canaanites are afraid. They're not afraid, at least the vast majority of them, because they somehow believe that this God is the one true God and their gods are idols. No, that's not why they're afraid. They're afraid because of how the pantheons of paganism work. It's not some gods exist and some gods don't. In their minds, it's the strongest God wins. And clearly there is reason to fear that they are not on the side of the strongest God. So they tremble. They prepare. They pray. They do their rituals to try and get their gods, however strong they might be, fully on their side, beseeching them, we can only imagine, to work similar miracles on their behalf. And Israel gets closer and closer and closer. These pagans have no reason to hope that anything other than their God's favor over the God of Israel's favor will save them. But as Israel finally approaches the land of Canaan, crosses over the Jordan in a miraculous act of water dividing, very similar to what happened at the Red Sea, especially considering Jordan at that point was in a flood state due to the rains. Jericho, in particular, is afraid. They know they're the first fortress that will be attacked as Israel crosses over to do war in Canaan. Israel, while they are completely depending on God under Joshua's leadership, they do go through some of the processes of war nonetheless. They send spies out to spy. And as they enter Jericho, we're told that they go into essentially what we might consider is probably either a private residence, but more likely perhaps a brothel, to try and remain hidden. In either case, it is a place where a woman named Rahab conducts her business as a prostitute. Now we might ask, why on earth would Israelites, followers of the Mosaic Law, go to a place like that? Some have argued, well, they're going there to purchase her business. I don't think that's a good argument. Think about the situation that they're in. They're trying to keep a low profile. They're trying to go to a place where people don't ask questions. Works pretty well for that, don't you think? But that's not the only reason it seems they go there, because Rahab, in particular, invites them in. And not just invites them in, but whether they tell her outright or exactly how all this transpired, she knows who they are serving. And she decides to help them. In fact, she not only lets them stay in the house there where they're at, or where she is at, where she conducts her business, but whenever people began to take notice that some foreigners have showed up in town, and someone apparently saw them go into Rahab's house, well, she hides them. She hides them on the roof. They're there, hidden under, essentially, bundles of flax, I believe, is the technical term that is used. Hidden there, trying to remain undiscovered as the king's messengers search. Rahab herself, as she is asked, she is questioned by the messengers of the king. She informs them that, in fact, those two men, I didn't know where they came from, but they left already. They went in this direction. And sends the messengers of the king on a wild goose chase, again, to protect the two spies of Joshua. All of this from a pagan. All of this from not just a pagan, but a pagan prostitute. Not exactly the first person that you would think someone following the law of Moses would consider to be a prime recruit, for lack of a better term. But as the king's messengers are sent along their way, the spies reemerge from their hiding place, and they have a conversation with Rahab. I forget who I was talking to earlier this past week, but this is one of those stories I wish we had more information about. I wish there was a little more detail given. But they have this conversation, and it does help us somewhat. Rahab essentially says, number one, everyone's scared of y'all because of what your God has been doing. Number two, I know that your God will win. Not that she knows from some supernatural means. She just has heard the evidence and pieced everything together and says, clearly your God is the stronger. So number three, she asks for an agreement. I've helped you. Now I ask you to help me. I know you're going to win when you attack this city. I want you to spare my life and the life of my family. If you do that, essentially the idea being, we're even. I've helped you, you help me. The spies agree. Now it's interesting The spies agree, already having known that God's desire as they go through and begin conquering the land of Canaan is for all the inhabitants to be driven out. But they agree nonetheless. They say, essentially, if you will gather all of your family in one place, whoever is in that one place will be spared. Everything else, everyone else, is going to die in this battle, at least everyone else in Jericho. But you will be spared, and whoever is with you. She lets them down. This is the best red cord I could find anywhere as far as pictures go. She lets them down by a scarlet cord. Scarlet, by the way, would have been an expensive item, most likely something she was given as a token of affection from one of her clients. But this scarlet cord is used to let them down. Her house is actually in the wall. A lot of times they would build compartments within large walls, and then if it came down to it, you would fill those walls up with stone. So it wasn't exactly the most permanent of dwellings. Good place to stick a prostitute. So they put her in this, she lets them down out of this wall with this scarlet cord. They inform her that this is to be the sign of where she is, so that the room containing this scarlet cord on the outside is to be spared. Eventually, the spies report back to Joshua. Joshua gets his orders from Yahweh. The people take a very interesting tactic to attack Jericho. They don't attack, in fact. They just march around. And after 7 days, they eventually shout and blow trumpets. Not exactly prime military strategy, even for their day, and yet, this is what God instructed. And at the shout and the sounds of the trumpets, a wall that should not have been able to fall without months of siege falls like that. Everyone on all sides of the Israelite army rush in and take the city, but Rahab and her family, because she has done what was required to gather them all into one place with the scarlet rope outside, they are spared. Rahab, we're then told, after the extermination of the city of Jericho, which, by the way, not only is the city taken, but is then razed and never meant to be rebuilt again. According to Joshua, he actually invokes a curse on anyone who would rebuild it. But Rahab and her family are spared, and they are brought back to the camp of Israel. It seems they become what we might call proselytes, converting to the Jewish law. And eventually, Rahab marries within the camp of Israel and has a son and a grandson and a great-grandson. And if you look through the history with any kind of detail, you will see that Rahab eventually has a however many great-grandson named David. And then many, many more greats. There will be a Joseph and a Jesus. Now, as we think about the story of Rahab, as always, a true story, but told for us as a story, I want us to consider a few questions that will be helpful for us to ask. First of all, I want us to consider the question, if everyone was afraid, why was Rahab the only one that sided with Israel? Think about it. If your city or your army or whatever, if you think it might be in danger, if you look at any kind of history at all, defections happen all the time, meaning people abandoning their army and turning themselves over to the other army to spare themselves. Usually is considered quite cowardly, at least by the ones who are left behind. But why is Rahab the only one that defects? Why is she the only one? Everyone's scared to death. Why is she the only one that actually tries to help Israel out, tries to go over and side with Israel? We're not told of anyone else leaving Jericho, finding the camp of the Israelites and saying, hey, y'all are going to win. Could we be your friends? Now, we know later on there's a group of Canaanites that do that in a completely different scenario. But in this whole city of Jericho, she's the only one. Why do you think that is? Certainly we're told Rahab had faith. That's why she's in Hebrews 11. But I want us to consider an insight we can find from the very beginning of Hebrews chapter 11. It's not talking specifically about Rahab, but it's setting up all the names that will be listed. The Hebrews writer says, without faith, it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. Now, there's something really interesting there that I want us to understand. As we mentioned, in the pagan religions that were followed by the Canaanites, no one would have denied that Israel's God existed. Everyone would have believed he existed. They would have just believed he was one of many. They would have believed that their gods and the God of Israel all existed and sometimes took sides with different people and all this kind of stuff. But no one would have just denied the existence of God. In fact, the idea of atheism as we see it today is actually a very, very modern thing. Very rare throughout most of human history. So they wouldn't have had a problem with the existence of Yahweh, the God of Israel. Why then, if they're so afraid of this God, they believe he exists, they believe he's powerful, and they're afraid of him, why don't they do anything about it? Well, a couple of things I want to propose. Number one, maybe they don't do anything about it because of peer pressure. Maybe they don't do anything about it because of loyalties. Maybe they don't do anything about it because of stubbornness. After all, again, this is just how things work. We have our gods, you have your gods. Whoever's lucky enough to have the strongest gods wins. That's just the way it works. It's not like people are constantly changing their allegiance. Your gods are your gods, and that's just the way it is. But that last phrase is really important. And he rewards those who seek him. You see, the pagans were not, meaning the pagan gods, they were not nice. The gods didn't care about people. Of course, they don't exist, but in the minds of those who invented them, they didn't actually care. They weren't actually good beings. We think of God. He is good. He is love. That's not how idols, if we want to call them that, because that's how they were represented. That's not how the gods of the imaginations of the pagans were. The gods were often uncaring, petty, cruel even. So why would any random god really care that much if I side with them and not with my own gods? In fact, they might get upset with me and punish me for abandoning being disloyal to my gods. But not Rahab. Rahab believed this God might be different. We don't know how much she understood about the one true God. Probably not a whole lot at this point. But she believed that there might be a reward. She believed this God might spare her. She believed there might be something worth it on the other side. Everyone else was afraid, just like Rahab. But only Rahab let that fear become faith. Only Rahab let that faith motivate her to seek God out. Again, I can't imagine that the spies just came up to her and said, "Hey, we're from Israel, what's up?" It seems that once she figured it out, most likely in the scenario, though we don't know, she's the one who said, "I want to help you." She let that fear become faith. And she let it motivate her to act. But another question we need to ask, because I don't think we always appreciate this, at least not fully, in the story of Rahab. I want us to consider what she was risking to do all that she did in helping the spies. Certainly, right, Rahab is risking being found out by her king. I don't know if you know anything about the social dynamics of the day, but even in any society you can imagine that a prostitute probably doesn't get a whole lot of rights under the government. It would be very, very easy if she is caught for her to be disposed of, for her to be punished in a whole number of ways by her king, by her government, if you will. So she's certainly risking that. She lies, after all, to the king's messengers. That's not exactly a small offense. But what else is she risking? You see, here's where I think we have to understand. She has no guarantees when she takes this first step of helping the spies. She has no guarantees that she's going to be spared. She has no guarantees that even if her life is spared, that she will be accepted. She has no guarantee that these Israelites actually are men of their word. She is throwing away her allegiance to her people with no assurance that she'll have a people after that. It reminds me a little bit of how the Jews would have felt whenever they left Judaism to become Christians in the New Testament, and especially those who were in predominantly Gentile areas. They're abandoning Judaism, so now they don't have those people, but maybe they don't have anyone. Are they going to be accepted? Gentiles, same way. They're abandoning the Gentiles, and they're now seen to be associated with the Jews, but the Jews might not want them. In fact, we see that exact thing happening at times. Paul has to address that. Rahab is putting herself in a situation where she might only have enemies. I don't know that many of us have ever been in a situation quite like that. Maybe some have. But it's not something I even like to imagine, much less experience. And yet, we think about the words of the psalmist. A psalmist who, if I recollect correctly about this particular psalm, is a descendant of Rahab. In God I trust. I shall not be afraid. What can flesh do to me? You see, her faith was not in Israel. Her faith was that the God of Israel would see what she did and reward her, as we just talked about. Now also, we could say, she's a prostitute, right? What does she have to lose? That's not exactly a fun life. And I say that with all irony intended. Even in the ancient world, maybe especially in the ancient world, surely she could not have had anything but a lot of misery in a lot of the things she experienced. But nonetheless, she still made the choice to trust that this God would do something for her, would see what she had done, and would reward her for it, despite literally everything. Let's throw one other thing out there. Well, two other things, really. Her family might have considered her a traitor. Like her actual family that she saves. We're not really told anything about them. But also, once she is spared, maybe even she's accepted into the camp, who would want a prostitute? And yet she does get married and have children, which is a fascinating concept within their society in their day. Things could have gone wrong in basically every way you can imagine. A million different ways things could have gone wrong. But Rahab chose to side with God anyway. Not only did she allow her fear to become faith and allow that faith to motivate her, but she accepted all the risks that came with that and chose to side with God. But lastly, I want us to consider one other question. Why did God spare Rahab? We understand that God values faith, but God had already instructed Israel to exterminate the Canaanites, to drive them out of the land. Why would he spare Rahab? It's interesting. This is one of the general questions, meaning about wiping out the Canaanites, that causes a lot of discussion and a lot of confusion within the religious world. How could a loving God order what seems to be almost a genocide of a whole group of people? Now, we don't have time to go into all those details, but I think we have a hint of some of the answer to it right here. If God's interest was genocide, as some people accuse him of, why would he spare someone who is of the people group that he once exterminated? Well, that tells us something, doesn't it? It tells us that God's issue was never with the race or the ethnicity of the people. It was about what they were doing. It was about all of the abominations that they were committing, which, by the way, we're told he gave 4 centuries for them to repent of. God spared Rahab because she chose to be different. She chose not to remain with the people who were acting against God, but instead take a step of faith towards God himself. Of all the people, too. You would think one of the more pious people in Jericho maybe makes up his mind, you know what, I'm going to try and see if this God will like me, will spare me. No, it's a prostitute that makes that decision. God spares her not because she is the right race, the right family. He spares her because she has the right faith, the right trust in him that all mankind is commanded to have. And we see as time goes on that many who are Jews by birth do not have the faith of Rahab. Jesus gives a long list in Luke chapter 4 of all the opportunities that God had through many of the prophets to do miracles in Israel. And instead, he did miracles for those who were not Israelites because they showed more faith. The same is true here. God doesn't care about all the superficial things, as God would later tell Samuel of Rahab's descendant. God sees the heart, not the outward appearance. God has always been eager. And this is something we don't ever want to forget, especially as we read the Old Testament, because of how it has been skewed in people's minds at times. God has always been eager to accept those who show faith, no matter who they are. It always drives me nuts when people talk about the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament as if they're two different beings. You realize how many times God spares people who, by all accounts, it doesn't seem like should be spared if we're using human metrics? How many times he does that in the Old Testament? That doesn't sound like just a purely jealous, hateful God that people try to portray the God of the Old Testament as. God has always looked for faith, looked for obedience, looked for people to stand out, not by the superficial, but by the spiritual. That's why Rahab is in Hebrews 11. That's why it's important that she's in Hebrews 11. You realize she's pretty much the only one that's not a Jew in Hebrews 11. Yes, she became part of the Jewish camp and married a Jew and all that kind of stuff, but she's not a Jew by birth. She's there to remind us that it's the faith that matters, not the birthright, not the ethnicity, not the background, the choice to put that faith in God. If a pagan prostitute could risk everything to put her faith in God, I want to leave us with this question this morning. What am I willing to do? What am I willing to do? Because according to a lot of standards that we often find ourselves using, I have not quite stooped so low. You have not quite stooped so low as to be a pagan and a prostitute. Unless there's some weird history of people in this room going on right now. Just kidding. In our minds, we think, oh yeah, she's way down at the bottom of the list. And yet she risked everything to put her faith in God. Am I willing to do that? Because if I'm not, you realize what that says about me. I don't even have as much faith as a pagan prostitute. Rahab is meant to be an example, to call us, to remind us of something better than just the status quo. To remind us not only not to give up on others, but not to allow our birthright, our standing, to desensitize us to the fact that we all are called to have this same faith. If there is something we can do this morning to help encourage you in your faith, to remind you of the God that we serve, we want to do that. We want to support one another. We want to pray for one another. If you want to learn more about Christ, if you want to put Him on in baptism, if you just want encouragement and prayers, whatever the case might be, please let us know so we can help as we stand and sing.
When we walk with the Lord in the light of His word, what a